Good afternoon. My name is Bob Klein. I'm here today with John Little as part of the Inform's History of Operations Research Project and also the MIT 150 Infinite History Project. John is an institute professor and a pioneer in the application of operations research to business and particularly to marketing. I've known John since the mid-1960s, first as a student, then teaching assistant, then business colleague. I've had my own company, Applied Marketing Science, for over 25 years, and I once said that everything I needed to know about running a company, I learned from John Little. Now, a lot's been written about John's many accomplishments, and our intention this afternoon is not so much to repeat what has already been said or written, though there will be some of that, but rather to add John's personal style and voice to what exists in other media. So to start out, John, tell us where you were born and where'd you grow up?
I was born in Boston on February 1st, 1928. But I grew up in Andover, actually the West Parish part of Andover, which is sort of ex-urban at that time. And my father commuted to Boston on the train, and I sometimes went with him. But to add a little to the written record, I grew up in the Depression.
Right.
And my father was a bond salesman. He had been, he was actually always a writer. He worked for a while for the Boston Herald as a reporter and then a rewrite man. But he switched to the securities business and became a bond salesman. But he was out of a job in 1933. They were jumping out of the windows in Wall Street at 1929. So, and I was 5 years old. Okay. Now, he eventually got another job, but in 1933, I started at something called the Pike School. Mrs. Pike had started a school in Shawshene Village, and she had a couple of grades there, and I started in first grade in 1933. And the way things worked then, my father had chickens, and he paid for the tuition with eggs.
Okay.
And I don't know anybody else like that, but I'm sure there are many. And after 2 grades, though, and I also started early. I started at 5. There were no kindergartens then. So I started early, and I maintained that relative youth throughout my career.
Okay.
But then I went to the Andover Public Schools, and I went through the 9th grade. But I was good in school. I mean, I did everything well but penmanship.
Okay.
And so my father decided that I could get a scholarship at Phillips Academy, which is in Andover. And so after the 9th grade, I went there. And I heard my father say, you know, astonishing things about my IQ and other things, which I had taken a test. So at Andover, I continued to be good in mathematics and the sciences. And I remember my mother's asking me how things were going. I was a day student, first of all, and I rode my bicycle to school sometimes, and then sometimes I had a lift from another person who was a day student. And my mother asked me, how things are going? And I said, fine.
Okay.
And then one day, they had an awards ceremony, and I won all kinds of prizes in mathematics and even one in German, which I didn't think I deserved. But math and physics were easy for me. And so it came to graduate, and so I asked advice from my, I don't know, I think it was my physics teacher or math teacher, where to go. And he said, go to MIT.
Okay. Do you remember if you applied anywhere else, or
No.
was it just sort of automatic?
No, no, and I got a scholarship, which was essentially for, and it was a remarkable scholarship. It paid tuition, which was, I think, $300 a term.
Right.
and an extra bonus, and it was a preference would go to Protestant white students from Brookline. No, I wasn't from Brookline, but
Yes.
and so I went to MIT. And
And
at
was
MIT,
majoring in physics sort of automatic, or?
no, I looked through the catalog, which was a big, thick thing then, online now, and I wanted to take all the courses.
Okay.
But I finally decided on physics as being something fundamental, and you could go places from there. And so I took classes, and my grades started very high. I had the first two terms, I had all A's. They were called H's at MIT at that time, but anyway. But two essentially B's, one each term, in mechanical drawing.
Oh,
So my penmanship is slipping. So from that start, I went slowly downhill. And I became the editor of Voodoo. Voodoo is the MIT humor magazine. And
I was stunned when I heard that, not from your lack of sense of humor, but just that I had never pictured you in that kind of a role.
well, I have a few pictures. And the other thing that I would mention about MIT was that I had a minor in hitchhiking to Wellesley.
Yeah.
And as it turns out, I married a Wellesley graduate, but not the one I was dating at the time.
Okay.
But the easiest hitchhiking I ever had was when I was dressed up in a tuxedo and I had a box of flowers in my hand. Got a ride like that.
Always works. And so after MIT?
After MIT, okay. Well, I told you it went steadily downhill. I started in the summer. World War II was still on, and it was 1945. And the MIT was on a schedule, a wartime schedule, which was 3 terms a year. And I was designated as 248, although I ended up graduating. I took a summer, spent a summer in Texas on a seismograph crew. But I ended up graduating in August 48. But the last summer, I got the first B I had ever gotten in a math course, and that shook me up. I wasn't doing the homework very well, but anyway. And then I also took a physics course, and I did exactly 1 problem during the whole course. And MIT is, you know, problem sets every week. And I did it, and it was, I spent 25 pages on it and passed it in. And I got back a kind of a question mark, so I flunked that course. So how do I accomplish this? Well, I was mostly sitting on the Esplanade listening to the concerts, lying on my back. And so at the end of that, but I did graduate with a so-so cum. I mean, well, no, a pretty good cum. So I decided that going further in school would be a mistake. And so I decided to hitchhike around the country. And hitchhiking was more common in those days. It's considered too dangerous now, but I don't think it's that different.
I don't think so either.
And
it was just as dangerous then.
That was just as dangerous, right. And I started across the top of the country, and I stopped in. My father was working in Buffalo, but I had a friend of mine from my freshman year who said, "You'll never make the West Coast." So I was determined to make the West Coast. And so I went across the top of the country, and we don't have the super highways then, and through Montana and Billings, Montana. And I would stay at Wise and inexpensive hotels is what I would do. And I remember Billings, Montana and Missoula, wonderful towns. And on into Washington State. And in Washington State, I was picked up by a truck, a farm truck. And he said, "Kid, do you want a job for a while?" And I said, "Sure." And so I worked on a sheep ranch. And that was very interesting. The people were very interesting.
Yeah, I bet.
They lived outdoor. There was one guy who had been in a forest fire, and so one side of his face was completely scarred. And there was another who was so quiet. He spoke in a whisper as we ate. So that was good, and I earned some money, but I still wanted to get to the West Coast, and so I went on to probably Portland, or I went on to Washington and down the coast, the Cascades, and I remember hitchhiking into San Francisco, and I got a ride with some con men. Now, there was a chief con man who had been taught by somebody else, and what he had was 2 apprentices.
Okay.
And they were going to San Francisco and stay at a first-class hotel and exit without paying the bill.
Okay.
So we rode down, and I left them, and I have no idea what happened.
Okay.
I had stayed at the Embarcadero YMCA, which I assure you, which was a big room and with cots in it. And the next to me was a sailor, and while he was asleep, he'd put his wallet in the pillowcase. And while he was asleep, somebody had slit the pillowcase and taken his wallet.
Oh.
That's the Embarcadero one.
Okay.
And it's long since torn down. And I also went to the symphony, courtesy of a friend of my mother's, and was asked about the symphony, and I said it was fine. But then I went to L.A., stopping with people I knew along the way. And then I decided I'd go home for Christmas. So I hitchhiked Route 66.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So I have hitchhiked old Route 66. And there's this song about that. And it, I remember this something about Flagstaff, Arizona. I was frozen to death in front of it was windy and wintry. So I went home, and then I went down. Then after Christmas, I decided I'd go to Florida. So I went down to Florida, and it turns out that everybody else was there too. All the hitchhikers and hobos were there. And so I decided to go to visit my sister and brother-in-law who were in Austin, Texas. And on the way out of town, I rolled over in a car. I was driving.
Oh, okay.
And a salesman, and frequently the drivers are salesmen hitchhiking. And and I was driving. And he said, "We can continue on." And I said, "Fine." And so I was driving, and up ahead, a car. Actually, it was a new car, and its right rear wheel skidded off the road, and he lost control of it, and it came across and swiped our bumper, and he went backwards into the ditch. And we rolled over. I remember thinking, I'm okay, and I said, "But it isn't over." And we rolled over and came up on the wheels.
Okay.
And the state police came by. And I give them a lot of credit. They figured out exactly what happened. And after that, my salesman remembered it exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
So there were adventures.
Yeah.
There were other adventures.
But then you went to work.
But then I went to work. And I went to work at GE in Schenectady. And I had interviewed there when I was a senior in college. And they'd offered me a job, but I decided to go hitchhiking. And I told them I'd been hitchhiking, and they were extremely pleased that I'd made it back,
Oh, yeah.
I guess. So they gave me a job, and I joined what was known as the physics program, which is rotating assignments in various locations. I was at the low temperature lab and at the tube division, and I met my wife-to-be, because she was a graduate of Wellesley, but I hadn't known her there, and was in the physics program, which was striving to get another talent pool besides electrical engineers.
Were there very many women in the programs, science programs at that time?
There were two in the physics program. This physics program of GE.
Out of how many?
Well, out of maybe 20.
Oh.
Anyway, so she and I both pseudo-independently decided to go back to graduate school. And so we interviewed and filled out forms and interviewed at some places, and we interviewed together usually. And I remember the form for the University of Chicago. It was so long, I refused to fill it out. I think she was admitted to there, but she was admitted to a lot of places, and I was admitted to MIT. And I asked my initial registration officer, I said, what about those things courses I flunked? And he said, oh, I don't know. I guess you're admitted, you're admitted. Well, forget about that. So I was still restless. And I had a friend named Fernando Corbato. And I lived in what was then the graduate house. It later became Ashdown, and now is Massey House. And it's at the corner of Mass Avenue and Memorial Drive. But after a while, we decided that it would be good to get an apartment. So we got an apartment over on Beacon Hill, and it was on Myrtle Street, and it was $40 a month, rent control.
Okay.
And that was pretty expensive as far as we were concerned, but it had been occupied by an elderly couple and a dog, and the place was an awful mess. So with elbow grease and what have you, we painted it up, and we became the inhabitants. And I was still dating the same woman, Elizabeth Alden, and eventually we got married, and and moved to Marlborough Street in a fifth floor walk-up. And I had a bicycle. It was a World War II Victory bicycle with one speed. But it was okay, and I used to commute. Now, meanwhile, I was still restless, and I passed my general exams in physics, and my the graduate registration officer was Philip Morse, who was a World War II operations researcher.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a book by Morse and Kimball, which is a collection of World War II declassified examples. And it's called Methods of Operations Research. So I was looking around for a thesis topic. Now, and also I had taken, I was kind of restless, and I'd taken a TA or an RA with JCR Licklider, who was actually a fairly well-known psychologist. And he was great, but I didn't want to go into psychology. But I made some movies with him where I advanced little objects on a felt blackboard, and in such that a series of stills turned into a movie.
Yes.
Anyway, so Morse said, would you be interested in an operations research thesis? Meanwhile, as a matter of fact, I had an RA in machine methods of computation, which Morse had, and that was supporting me. And as part of this RA, Corby and I computed a table of spheroidal wave functions. Okay. Well, I have to. Well, there were esoteric functions,
Yes.
and these were only the coefficients for an expansion in spherical Bessel functions. But anyway, so we did it. But we did it on Whirlwind. Now, Whirlwind was a digital computer which I learned to use, and Corby learned to use, and he later on became essentially a well-known professor of computer science. And then I heard about a project that was out of the EE department, and it had to do with hydroelectric systems and the Bonneville Power Administration, and they wanted some research done on and Morse wisely felt that could be an interesting thesis. But he would keep me on his payroll because he didn't trust the engineering department. Exactly. So that's how I did my thesis. And what I did was I came in, Morse saw me weekly, and for maybe a half an hour. And I sat on an uncomfortable couch, which I'm sure he sat people that he wanted to get rid of. But he sat over near the window, and he had a tiny postage stamp of a blackboard, which you couldn't get any equations written on. And ever since then, I've had a big blackboard or a whiteboard. Morse suggested I work out an example. And so I sat down to work out an example. And then I had an idea. And I remember crossing Killian Court, it was then Great Court, and saying, I've got it. I know how to do it. Because the basic problem is, and here's Grand Coulee Dam.
Yeah.
And you can see the waters rushing over it. And that is wasting energy for the Bonneville Power Administration. And what it means is that the water is not going through the turbines. So this is basically the spring runoff season, when it looks beautiful and tourist attraction. Now, in the fall, the snow falls in the mountains. The rainfall, the precipitation is in the mountains, and it falls as snow. And the stream flow goes very, very low. But there is stream flow, and it's a lot of variation. And we had records for, 50, 60 years. And the problem is that you have a big reservoir of water, which is really latent energy. However, if you start drawing down the reservoir, because the stream flow is low, you drop the head. And head is water times stream flow plus any discharge you elect to take. That's the energy. And so you want to draw down the reservoir, but you don't want to get it all done, because then you have very low head. However, you want to get it done before the stream flow, the next flood comes in. So that was it. And as I was walking across the Great Court, I said, I've got it. I know how to formulate it. So I went back and wrote it down. And I told Morse about it. And I started using it. I started programming it. And I told Morse about it. And he said, is this the way you want to do it?
Okay.
And I said, yes. He said, okay. So, it was, actually I'd reinvented dynamic programming, which Richard Bellman was then at Rand writing about it. And I told Morse about that because a paper appeared in the journal Operations Research. And I told Morse about it, and he said, well, we better finish it and publish it. Anyway, let me tell you about Whirlwind. That's the object of my affections, the Grand Coulee Dam.
Yeah.
And here is a picture carefully posed of the control room for Whirlwind. And I describe it as my personal computer, 1952-54. Actually, the purpose of Whirlwind was for air defense. It was a prototype computer for air defense, and so the work during the day was totally classified. But in the evenings, Corby and I had it. Well, not to ourselves, but there were some other people too. But I call it my personal computer. And this is a picture of what I call a motherboard, Whirlwind motherboard and CPU, 1952.
Huge.
That's right, it's huge. And you can see all the people out posing out here. And that person is Jay Forrester. And I didn't know him at the time. I now know him at the Sloan School, but where he's changed careers. But he was in charge, and he has the patents on some
Core memory.
Core memory,
Yeah.
right. And this picture is the output. We had or Whirlwind had a camera which took photographs on command. And this picture shows the top graph is stream flow, which you see is off scale at either end because of the runoff. And then it goes down and is to low level and then starts picking up again. Okay, now my algorithm is working here, and this is essentially what you would have to pay a power company, a steam-driven power company. This is the number of kilowatt hours you would have to pay them, and this is the height of the reservoir, and you can see it dips down in the fall and winter, and then rises rapidly in the spring. And I also want to point out the clock, which is photographed by the computer, and the date is September 18th, 1954, and it's a.m. So I'm in the last stages of my thesis then, and it's 6 minutes of 7. So
that was your thesis, and then
that's right.
And you graduated with a degree in operations research, or
well, I've always I did my general exams in physics. There weren't any OR courses. There was one by George Wadsworth in the math department, but which I took, but by and large there weren't any courses. I took courses in partial differential equations and other interesting stuff as part of my physics training. But I generally list my thesis as physics and operations research. And given enough space, I will say that I passed my general exams and I wrote my thesis in operations research.
And then from there,
Okay.
a little time in the Army.
Yeah. Well, at that time, what I was facing, I mean, I'm just missed World War II. So I had a draft liability until I was 35. And when you're 25, 35 looks like infinity. So I said, I'll get my service out of the way. And so I let myself get drafted. And Betty stayed with my mother in Andover for a while. And I went drafted. I did basic training at Fort Dix, New Jersey. And then the Army had decided to not be as stupid as in World War II. And so I got a special assignment, which was doing military operations research at Fort Monroe, Virginia. And I was working with field grade officers who were very nice, and we ignored the ranks because I had a PhD and they didn't. and there were some civilians also with PhDs. And except that I was called out every now and then to do KP. Why everything went smoothly, and I bought a boat. Betty and I scraped up our worldly fortune, which was $900, and bought a boat which was considerably bigger than a lot of the officers' boats. And but it was a sailboat, and not many of them had sailboats. So we got in and out of trouble all over Chesapeake Bay, and had a great time. And okay, and I have pictures. Named the boat Queequeg. Queequeg is a very is a very positive character in Moby Dick. So, and then we had our first child, which was Jack, John N. Little, who will reappear later. So then we took a job at Case Institute of Technology in Cleveland. And that was actually a pretty productive time. And the way it worked was that Russ Akoff, there was Akoff, Churchman, and Aronoff, who have an early book on operations research. But Russ Akoff was the salesman, and he used to sell projects to various and sundry people. And some of them were in marketing, I mean, a lot of them were in marketing. And that got me exposed. We had a project with M&M's candies, and I've had dinner at the in the dining room of the Hackettstown Inn with Forrest Mars, who eventually got control from his sister and was for a while the owner of Mars and M&M's candies. And I think it's still a private corporation, and extremely rich and extremely successful. But the way that the plant was organized was everybody was in a big room. I mean, the desks were stationed so you could get in between them. But the problems were interesting. They were a very gutsy company, and very experimental. For example, and we were consulting for them and analyzing their data. And I first learned what a promotion was from their sales data. It's actually shipments. But they had these huge peaks in them. And I said, that's not a Poisson process. And they said, oh no, that's right. Those are promotions. And we run a promotion, and the trade stocks up on it, and it big peaks. So we analyzed some of their data, and they decided with some prodding, with some suggestions from us, to run an experiment. So they took maybe a third of the country. I mean, they weren't cheap, and they stopped advertising. I also learned about advertising agencies and their reps. And so nothing happened. And they waited a few months, and it started to go down. And they waited another 3 months, and it started to go down rather abruptly. They said, okay, we'll start advertising again. Mostly it was spot advertising. And we analyzed this to build a kind of a response curve, and we presented our results. And there was one feisty member, a graduate student, who converted this marginal analysis into a what he called a rule curve, which was a graphical way to reward the agency on a marginal cost basis for finding lower cost spots. And the agency was up in arms. And I think they probably correctly, but they never, M&M's never implemented that. But anyway, there was another project with Standard Oil of Indiana, and it was on gas stations. And an executive at Standard Oil in Indiana said of Russ Akoff, I'm not sure what he's selling, but I want to buy some of it. So that's why we had the project. And Russ was like that. Very controversial guy.
So that was really your introduction to marketing.
That's
and
right.
Operations research and marketing.
That's right. And I had a course, Operations Research and Marketing. It was based on these things and little problems I made up. And we had Cummins engine, which was another one of them. Also, while I was at Case, I wrote a paper which has become Little's Law, and I'll give you the title of the paper.
Well, I've got it here. Proof of the queuing formula, L equals lambda W.
Thank you. It's, I know it as Little 1961.
Yeah, right.
Okay, well, this, well, when I first came to Case, Russ said, Little, you're from MIT, how about a course on queuing?
Okay.
Well, I was at MIT, yes, but I had my nose in the hydro systems, not queuing. But that's okay. I'm game to learn. And Morse did a lot with queuing, and he wrote a book called Queues, Inventories, and Maintenance while I was there at Case. And I started using that as a text. And this formula was widely known at the time. However, it was known in specific cases, you know, Poisson arrivals and exponential service, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Standard case of beautiful, simple mathematics. So, as I was teaching the course, I was kind of challenged by a student, Sid Hess, who actually was a chem engineering graduate of MIT. And I was telling people that the formula was much more general. And I had a heuristic argument with pictures of, you know, things, cues. And so, and the class understood my argument. And they said, well, how hard, well, Sid asked, how hard would it be to prove it formally? And I said, well, it shouldn't be too difficult. Famous last words. So he said, you should do it. All right. So anyway, I bought some books and I took them to Nantucket, where we spent the summer, and I worked on it there, and eventually I wrote it up and I sent it off, and it was published. All right. So what I thought at that point, and the way I went about publishing it, thinking about it, was you need something more general, and so I bought math books. I bought a bunch of math books and learned a bunch of mathematics, and worked out a proof. But I said, I don't want to be a mathematician. I want to be an OR person, and so I want to. I'm not going to do any more of this. So I forgot about it. But for 40 years,
Yeah.
but then came back. But it's a really different story.
Yeah. So after Case, then you
Then I'm
came
back-
back to MIT.
Yeah, back to MIT. One other thing I did at Case was I had a student who came to me with a proposal to solve a traffic signal problem. And he had data from Waltham, the geometries of Waltham, Massachusetts. I don't know where he got them, but we published that, and that was a pretty good paper. Then, okay, it's back to MIT, and at MIT I continued that line of work. And generalized the problem of synchronizing traffic signals to a grid, and that was that. But I also published, while I was at MIT, a paper on the traveling salesman problem, which has a particular contribution by me. This had started at Case too, with a student named Kata Murthy, and he had a tree method, and he was solving the trees by assignment problems. And we ended up with multiple authors, but the last author was a Sloan Fellow at MIT, who I said, we'd like to do some calculations with this. And so he was from IBM, and so he had access to computers, and I think we did use the IBM at MIT, but he was willing to do the programming. And he suggested a new idea. And well, let me interrupt and give you my contribution, which is lingual.
Okay.
I understood everything. It's actually pretty simple. And what you do is you have a tree. You can represent the various alternatives as a tree, and the traveling salesman problem is how to go to a bunch of cities and have the shortest path, the shortest connected path. And there have been examples where people had worked them out, laboriously by hand, special arguments. But we were Kata Murthy and I and Doris Sweeney, the IBM guy, we're looking at this tree, and what I needed was a way of describing what we were doing. And I remember going up and I finally had a way to describe it. And I remember going up and telling my wife that I had it. And it was branch and bound. So what you have is a tree with, you know, a node at the top, and you go down, down, and you go down, and you have these nodes, and you have, I don't know, looks like a tree, and what you do is at each node, you're going to select a branch to go on. And the way you do it is you calculate a lower bound on what you can find on that branch. Mm-hmm. And each sub-problem, as Katamorty was doing assignment problems, but what Durasweeney observed was they were traveling salesman problems, which gave a tremendous symmetry to the whole algorithm. So at each bound, we set up a new traveling salesman problem, and at each node, and we found a bound on the most you could hope to get out of that direction. Mm-hmm. And that's the way we solved it. And as I used to say, we set the indoor record. Right. For size of, we drew matrices at random. And we had the indoor record, which was 40. Right. So anyway, but branch and bound has been picked up and is throughout the literature as how you approach these problems. Okay. And it's also there are variants that branch and do something else.
Okay. With a lot of detours into traveling salesmen and stuff, you really got involved in marketing and full time then in the mid '60s.
Right, right. And that's when I think. Well, what year is your master's degree?
Mine was 68.
68?
Yeah.
Well, we had the marketing game.
Right.
And you were my TA for the marketing game. Right. But I was really in marketing, and we had a new marketing group with Glenn Urban. We had Arnie Amstutz for a while, mm-hmm. And a very creative guy, but also a creative businessman.
Yes.
And we had Al Silk, and later Rick Boghosi, and we had a lot of good people, but and then a student that turned up at the OR Center, and I was technically a supervisor, and that was John Hauser. And he was turned on by a paper we'll get to. Mm-hmm. But prior to that, I had a student in the Sloan School, Leonard Lodish, who had an undergraduate degree from Kenyon, I think, in mathematics. But he was interested in OR, but he tells me that he went around to Miriam Sherbin, who was an administrative woman who glued the school together, and she recommended that why don't you Lynn asked her advice, and she said, why don't you go talk to John Little about marketing? So he came, and he found me working on a media problem. And we did we co-published a simple model in this Industrial Management Review. So then I started working on Mediac, and which is a careful analysis of the media problem with definition of terms and models which viewed advertising as essentially exposure as a little jump in your perception and then a slow decay. And we formulated that and eventually published it in operations research, and we had data and all good things. And
were you working with any agencies at the time, or was it?
I think not. But Len wanted to form a company, and he was influenced in this by Arnold Amstutz, who was always forming companies. And so I said, well, we have to do some market research. And so I reached around behind me and got out the Boston Yellow Pages and looked for ad agencies. And there were many, many ad agencies. And I said, that does it. Let's form a company. So, but Len was a lot of the stimulus, and he sold the first project, and it was to a company in Providence, which I don't recall the name. And so we formed a company, and he put in $500 and I put in $500, and we incorporated. Then my then secretary, Betsy Wood, went to work at Young and Rubicam, and her boss at Young, she told her boss in New York about our company and our computerization of the media selection process. I mean, which has never been. Well, there's stuff in the literature, but not very much, and it's not. Most of it is not real life. So we were eager to use it, and so we wrote a contract with Telmar, which was hideous in retrospect. We were so afraid we were giving something away we shouldn't. but it all worked out because everybody was good friends. And they started, and the gentleman at Young at Rupcam was named Stan Federman, and so Len and Betsy Wood and Stan were the major show, and they added other people, and they Stan went out and sold it, and I remember going to New York, and I forget, there was a staunch researcher, a well-known advertising researcher, who a couple of them, who liked our work, and so they were off and running. Telmar still exists. Sam Federman is long since retired, and Len is retired too.
Yeah.
But
is that the first marketing model that you sold?
That's right, but I think that's right. But Len, and Len sold it.
Yeah.
I did the research.
Yeah.
I did the yellow pages.
But I think putting a name on a marketing model and then, selling it.
That's right.
Is turning into a product.
That's right. That's a product. I don't know how we protected it, but later at MDS and the name of the company was Management Decision Systems,
Right.
or MDS. And meanwhile, back at the ranch, we hired a couple of programmers, and Glenn Urban was getting in the act, and we hired a couple of programmers who were MIT undergraduates, and Len began developing models, and so did Len. Len developed a product called Call Plan, which was helped a salesman plan his calls and route.
Right. How many times to call on each?
Yeah, that's
each
right.
of each of his customers.
And then we got a project with Nabisco. I don't remember. Oh, well, we ran summer 2-week summer courses, and explained what we called OR in marketing, or management science and marketing, and we had people come in, and we explained what we were doing, and Glenn would talk about his stuff. I would talk about Mediac and adaptive control, which was another model I developed. And so we were off and running. Now, but it turned out that software was part of the, we hired, among other people, Bob Klein.
Yeah. Right.
What was your number?
I was number 2, and
Number 2.
full-time employees.
Full-time employees.
I missed being number 1 by a month.
I see. Who was 1? Rick Harris?
Rick was the first.
These
he'd
were
gotten laid off from Data General, or from Digital, I think.
I see.
And
well, we hired our students, basically master's students, and Len now had his PhD, And we had our tool was the computer, and our mathematics were marketing models. And the principals, who were the academics, and wanted to stay academics, felt that what they would like to do was do the first application of the new model and then publish it, because we're academics, and then turn it over to others, which were smart master students, and that worked very well.
The computer systems that were, developed, and whether we had time sharing,
Right.
and that was the, access to computers at that time.
That's right. There was a project at MIT called Project MAC,
Right.
M-A-C in capital letters, and it stood for multiple access computing and something else. I don't know what the other thing was, but it essentially was taking a mainframe and time sharing, and this you had to have an operating system, and you had to do things to make that possible. And it was, it still exists in big mainframes, but it's basically supplanted by the personal computer.
Sure.
And now the handhelds.
These summer programs, is that where the contacts with Nabisco and Coca-Cola
Yeah.
came from?
Right. So I did a project, as a result of this, I did a project with Nabisco, and a model building project, and also at Coca-Cola. And this was extraordinary good fortune, because they are totally different products and distribution systems. Nabisco had cookies and crackers, basically, and plants to manufacture them, and then salesmen who go into supermarkets and set up and deliver the product, at least in those days. And Coca-Cola doesn't make any soft drinks. It only makes syrup.
Right.
And it has a huge distribution system. Well, what that means is that there's nothing in Atlanta but a big building,
Right.
which supervises the distribution system, and they have bottlers out in the boondocks, and who are frequently independent operators, or might not be. So it was wonderful, and Coca-Cola was very interested in advertising, and things having to do with that, but they monitored their distribution system constantly, and they were able to do experiments.
How important was it to be working with people inside companies like that for, both ideas as well as classroom.
Yeah,
stuff.
well, I often claimed that if my license to go into a classroom and talk about marketing is really based on having the MDS firm doing it and being there with brand managers as they talked about their problems.
Mm-hmm.
And are our models relevant?
The Models and Managers paper from 1970, I mean, I remember reading it in management science, sort of after we'd talked about my coming to work for management decision systems, but before it had actually happened, because I think it came out in April of 1970, and I was just blown away by the basic concepts and what makes a good model, and that whole
Yeah.
the whole picture. What motivated you to write that article?
Well, like many things, sort of came together quickly. Although I spent a lot of time working out writing it. But let's talk about heretofore. The econometricians count on having a big database with a lot of observations. But they work, I mean, and particularly in those days, they work with linear models. And it's not very hard to see that linear models don't work. For example, in advertising, a linear model of advertising would say, as a decision tool, you either advertising 0 or infinity.
Right.
So we weren't doing that sort of thing, and we had more complicated models, and finally, I kind of threw away a constraint, and the constraint was that you had to have data for everything. What I saw people doing is using their own good judgment. They would stare at the data and make up their mind. And so why not go to them for their judgment? So I started building models which were judgmental. I said, let's take advertising. So we now have a given level of advertising. Now, what would happen if we had all the advertising we could possibly use? How high would sales go then? Okay, suppose we take our current level and increase it 50%. How much do you think the sales would go up? And also, suppose we cut advertising and didn't do it. And how low do you think the sales would go? So asking these questions of people, and there's a lot of data. In other words, they know what kind of normal sales are, and they've been fiddling with their advertising. They have a guess at how much it would go up, and what the limits were. I mean, they're just physical limits.
Yeah, I mean, I remember running those kinds of workshops with a half a dozen.
That's right.
Marketing guys in the room, and and the people from an ad agency and brand management, and and they would make their estimates, and we'd have them do it separately, and then we would tally up what the median turned out to be, and people would argue about it and stuff. But you're right, they have they have their own internal models. Yeah, I mean, people make judgments, and it's when you make them explicit, then they're able to say, okay, well, if this is what I really believe, then
That's right.
Here's what I ought to do.
That's right. That's right. And and there's data analysis in the back, but what I ended up doing was writing a paper, which I think summarized my impressions of what we were doing in the field, in various kinds of models. Glenn had a whole series of models, but and he had specific measurements he did, but that's fine, that fits in. So I wrote a paper called Models and Managers, the Concept of a Decision Calculus, and I called the product of this a decision calculus. Okay, and my first sentence is of this paper is and this paper developed. Let me throw in an aside. This paper developed a following, and was deemed one of the 10 most influential papers in management science in the first 50 years, which I felt very flattered about. But my first sentence is, the big problem with management science models is that managers practically never use them. And it's not a negative paper. But I sort of characterized the problems, and I suggested characteristics of the model that a model should have, which I felt made it more appealing to managers. And so there's a list of maybe 7.
Right.
And a model to be used by a manager should be simple, robust, easy to control, adaptive, as complete as possible, and easy to communicate. By simple, I meant easy to understand. a robust, hard to get absurd answers from it, by easy to control, that the user knows what input data would be required to produce desired output answers. Adaptive means that the model can be adjusted as new information is acquired. Completeness implies that important phenomena will be included even if they require judgmental estimates of their effect. And finally, easy to communicate with means that the manager can quickly and easily change inputs and outputs and change inputs and obtain and understand the outputs. So that summarizes a 30 or 40 page paper.
Yeah. Well, and you know, I've in my career made that kind of required reading for people who work for me.
I see.
That, if you know, if we're doing something that the client doesn't understand, they're not going to believe it.
That's right.
And you know, all of those things are really critical in any marketing model. When did the term marketing science emerge? I mean, there's the journal Marketing Science, but before that there was sort of the concept of marketing science, even though some people would argue that marketing isn't a science, or it would have at that time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let me take care of the journal, because I think the journal reinforced the term. Of the two professional societies that were rather duplicative, and eventually I was involved in their merger. The Operations Research Society of America, ORSA, and TIMS, the Institute of Management Sciences, did a lot cooperatively, and I had traditionally published in operations research and have many papers there, although this Models and Managers happen to be in management science. But of the two societies, at one point, as there's more and more stuff was coming out in what could be called quantitative marketing and measurement, I think I was president of ORSA, right, and Frank Bass of the University of Texas at Dallas was a president of TIMS. And TIMS had a very strong group, a subsection called the College of Marketing. And we were both in it, and they actively had conferences and dealt with marketing issues and models. So at one juncture, Frank and I got together and said we should start a new journal for this stuff, and I wanted it to be a joint journal, and so did Frank, as far as that goes. So he didn't have any problem with Tim's counsel. I had a little problem with the ORSA counsel, which finally said, "Oh, let John have his journal," and we named it Marketing Science. And very interesting, the Bill Perscala, who was the name of the editor of operations research at the time, stopped publishing marketing articles, and not so the editor of management science. He continued to publish them and had special issues on marketing. And that is to some extent true to this day. Both journals are now of the umbrellas of society, Informs, but there's much less marketing in operations research than there is in management science. Anyway. So I think it was going on. It was going on, and both Frank and I were publishing, and this paper was one of our products, and it's certainly and the illustration, the concept is more general, but the illustration is strictly marketing, and we learned a lot in Mediac and Brand Aid and applying these models in the world. Brand Aid was another. It was a two-part paper. One, some theory, and the other, an example. Basically, was Oreos.
Yeah, right. What were some of the lessons that you drew from your sort of management decision systems and the entrepreneurship that you showed there?
There was a session in Maryland. We had a conference in Maryland, and Bob gave a talk. and he's mentioned one of the things.
Well, I think running a company forces you to address a lot of issues that
That's right.
that marketing models maybe can gloss over.
That's right. That's right.
But at MDS we were there's a big transition from software to support models and building models like Brand Aid and Sprinter and Call Plan and so on, to software for building decision support systems.
That's an excellent point. The
term decision support systems, did you coin that as well, or?
No. Let's see. No. I won't say Michael Scott Martin.
Okay.
Pointed.
Right.
He coined management decision system.
Oh, yeah.
and then he had to have something else. Peter Keene, I think, was another faculty member at Sloan, and Michael was in information systems area. But it was descriptive. The thing is, I like descriptive titles, and decision support system is descriptive because it implies data and software and access, and actually you get to models, and perhaps it's time for another anecdote. Yeah, but we had these software developers, and there was one, and I don't think he ever got a master's degree. Jay Wirtz.
Jay? No, I don't think so.
No, never did.
No.
Well, it was because he was too busy making
Yeah,
money.
right.
But his view of the world was, you people think that these models are all different. I think they're all the same. And what I would like is some budget to implement a more general scheme. And I remember sitting in Nantucket, where we used to go to our house down there, and talking to Jay about software requirements. And I said, you have products, you might have, but you will likely have multiple products. You have time periods, but you might have weeks or months or any time period. And then you have geography. You have multiple cities or markets, and you have at least those three things, and probably we can think of some more. And Jay said, you'd like to specify it at runtime. And I said, well, that would be nice. And so he built it. And he added all sorts of functional capabilities. I mean, you get add, multiply, and so forth, but aids to time series. But what you had was the ability to give a name to the months. It could be February, March, and April, or it could give a name to the markets. It could be New York and Chicago and L.A. and multiple products, and it just worked. And you could take a bright master's degree or MBA. It's now it's an MBA. It wasn't then, but MBA from MIT or Wharton, and they could, with very little training, operate this thing and set up databases. And so, as a consulting company, we had people doing miracles.
Well, I mean, companies like Nabisco and Coke have had just mountains of data, and if a manager wanted to know kind of what were sales in Chicago last week. The guy would run off, and a day later would come back with the report, and the manager would then say, well, is that up or down from last year? And, back and forth and back and forth, and weeks would go by before the manager really got the answer to the
That's right.
question, and Express let
That was the name of our software,
Yeah.
Express.
let people first get access to this information very quickly, but then also do all sorts of transformations to it to get the answer to the question they were really asking.
That's right.
You can tell the
Yeah.
Coke story.
Yeah, I have a Coke story, which I think that this MBA here is John Reed,
Probably.
who has a piece in the Sloan, has a quote in the Sloan 100th anniversary book. And he's at a higher level in the company than he was then. But he'd been so I will scan this and read it. Once upon a time, which is 1973, an MBA student took a summer job with a large food manufacturer, namely Coca-Cola. He reported to the management science in the principal division of the company. The MBA was assigned to put key marketing information, basically store audit data, on a time-shared computer, and this would be in Express. The goal was an easy-to-use retrieval system. Okay, he did this. By the end of the summer, word of the system had reached the marketing manager of the major product of the division, who asked for a demonstration. The MBA and the management scientists showed the marketing management how simple English-like commands could retrieve data items, sales, share, price, distribution level, each by brand, package size, and month. Package size is another thing. Brand is another dimension. The marketing manager was impressed. You must be fantastically smart, he said. The people downstairs in MIS have been trying to do this for years, and they haven't gotten anywhere. This is typical of that senior management of that day in their MIS departments. So it was hard for the MBA to reject this assessment out of hands, but he did acknowledge, and this is a key point, that the software has changed and high-level analytic languages are available on time sharing and make it easy to bring up such systems. Okay, the MBA and the management scientist, flushed with success, and we essentially were dealing with a management scientist, and the MBA eventually went to work for Coca-Cola. I'd like to know, the marketing, he said, ask us anything.
Famous last words.
Famous
Yes.
last words. Well, the marketing manager thought a minute and said, I'd like to know how much the competitor's introduction of the 40-ounce package in Los Angeles cut into the sales of our 16-ounce package. Well, the MBA and the management scientists looked at each other in dismay. What they realized right away is, and what you might, with a little thought, is there isn't any data in the computer about sales that didn't occur. So this isn't a retrieval question at all. It's an analysis question. Okay, now the marketing manager had no idea that I mean, it was just a fact as far as he was concerned, and so why wouldn't it be there? Now, what you need to answer the question is a model. And in this case, it's a pretty simple model that you could, and we sat around and at the time and we talked about it. You could take the market share before the competitive introduction and extrapolate it forward and assume that that's the baseline reference point, and then calculate how much that share and therefore sales you had lost in this time period. And but the miracle of the Express software compared to its competition was that of few keys pushed on the keyboard, and out came the answer. You know, in SharePoints, in cases and ounces.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a few lessons that I drew for this paper, and that is managers ask for analysis, not retrieval, as well as retrieval. Good data is vital. You've got to have it, and it's got to be in there, and it's got to be right. You need models. They're often simple models, but you need them to give the full picture of the market. And you need an intermediary. The well-trained management scientist at Coke was such an intermediary. I mean, I've seen when I think it was also at Coke when somebody had a keyboard and had a program going, asked the manager to sit down. Well, he didn't know where the keys were. So it was very quick, very, very quick to find a substitute. But another lesson was quick. If you could answer the question when it was asked, essentially immediately, it made all the difference in the world. Right. And one question leads to another. And you're problem solving on the computer. And that's and that's because of the software, and we did very well with it.
I mean, it's really the online analytic processing, OLAP.
Yes. Oh, that's right, OLAP. Oh, I had forgotten. I was trying to remember the term, but there's also another element. It's the multi-dimensional database, right, which was ignored by MIS for a long time in favor of relational databases. Well, relational databases are great, but OLAP was essentially the answer, online analytic processing.
Express core of that actually still exists inside of Oracle
Right.
and their system.
MDS or IRI actually by that time, MDS was absorbed by IRI, Information Resources Inc. in 1985. And later, Express continued to develop and eventually was sold to Oracle for $100 million. Something.
And Oracle, and there's still some of the old MDS people are still there, still at Oracle, keeping.
Phil Johnson.
Phil Johnson.
Phil
And
Johnson.
Andy Goldberg.
I see.
So.
How about UPC data?
Yeah, UPC data came along then, and sort of changed things by an order of magnitude, at least.
Right. We last had data. I mean, before that we had factory shipments.
Right.
And there's all sorts of problems with that.
Plus, it's only your data.
It's only your data.
You don't see your
UPC data was everybody's data, thanks to, I guess Nielsen and IRI. UPC stands for Universal Product Code. It's the barcodes on the side of your package. And there are a couple of things we did with that. One, Peter Guadagni was a master's student of mine at MIT, and he's had a summer job with Bob Klein.
Right.
And he's a very smart guy. I had lunch with him last week in San Francisco.
Yeah.
But we got a hold of some panel data. And I don't know, you can probably tell the story of its acquisition better than I.
Well, this was the Kansas City panel data. This was 6 stores in Kansas City where Sammy, which was a division of Time Incorporated,
Inc,
and they were collecting warehouse withdrawal data, which was, and saw the UPC data, scanner data as being a step closer to the actual sale of the product than warehouse withdrawals. And so they were trying to run a pilot program in Kansas City where people would show a card when they checked out. Now everybody, of course, shows their loyalty cards. You got a keychain full of them. But they would train, people would show these cards, and so you would have a complete record of not just what the store sold in a week, but what a household had purchased over a period of time. And they took the coffee category and made it available for academic research.
And we used it.
Yeah.
Peter used it in his thesis. And the underlying technology is the so-called logit model, multinomial logit model, also called by the statisticians logistic regression. And it the data tells you the price paid, the in-store observation tells you what is on display, and there are features which appear with coupons in the Sunday supplements. So you have a number of control variables that potentially influence the customer, and you have the stream of purchases which the customer made, and this is now a famous paper because Bob Klein got out and got to the data first, and Peter wrote it up, and Peter and I published it, and it's a very heavily cited paper because everybody saw that this was something that they could do. I mean, many other academics and other databases became available, and people saw that this was a sandbox that they could play in, and they made variations. But there's something called the Guadani little loyalty, which is very hard to beat in terms of forecasting ahead. And I have always said I've never seen, multiple regression to anything like this in terms of its ability to forecast. And it exists today, and people still work over some of these problems, and there are new technologies out there to deal with it. But it's all marketing science.
Yeah.
It's all marketing science. But marketing is a practical subject, and you're trying to do somebody some good. So, but you need the underlying behavior in order to do that.
So UPC data was really big data in the 80s, and it was an order of magnitude more information than we had, or orders of magnitude more information than we had from just store shipments or store sales alone, because we had it down to the individual family level.
Right.
And you created a system called Cover Story that helped essentially interpret that data automatically.
Right, right. And the guinea pig client was Ocean Spray Cranberries, which was an MDS client, and had databases readily available. But what I was trying to do is to write a report about significant events that were occurring in the data, and so that somebody didn't have to sit down and scan everything, put it on the screen and inspect it. And this would be done automatically and with the highlights picked out. And so we had a bunch of words which are descriptive of the products, and connecting words like and is and things. And so we wrote plugins sentences, and it was a huge WordPerfect program by one of the authors of this paper, and it was it was pretty useful, and it has since been overtaken by natural language programming and other good stuff. But this was an early exercises in automated analysis, and was appreciated by the people who used it.
Right.
And it was also had the compliment of a competitive company copied it,
Right.
essentially, giving it a different name. But that's fine.
Yeah.
But I think it was another step toward automated analysis, and you had sort of this year versus last year plots automatedly put out for particularly for products that had some significant changes.
Yeah. So you mentioned before that MDS was acquired by or merged into
Yes,
IRI in
that's right.
the mid-'80s, and I know you were involved in a lot of the meetings around the creation of InfoScan,
Right.
which was the
Oh yes, right.
was the
Right. InfoScan.
first giant UPC database, with national data.
That's right. And my former student, Len Lodish, and another former student, Majid Abraham, were authors of a paper which I guess was InfoScan or Promotion Scan.
Promotion Scan.
But it was a published paper
Right.
by two of my former
Right.
doctoral
Right.
students.
And so
Which I used to use it, and I for a long time I taught a marketing models class, and that was a section of it.
So you went from sort of the small company to the big company. IRI was, I think, the fourth largest market research company in the world at the time they acquired us.
Right. Well, and then as I was on the board of directors,
Right.
and you have board of directors issues, things like, how are we doing this quarter?
Right.
Not marketing science.
Not marketing science. So what have you been doing more recently?
Well, I've returned to Little Slaw. Little Slaw started popping up, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago. And by then it was called Little Slaw, not L equals lambda W.
Yeah.
And I've had a lot of fun, and the issue, it's been picked up, particularly in operations management, and I was approached to write a chapter, and I said, well, I haven't looked at this for 40 years. And a chapter in a book. and I got Steve Graves to help me with the OM. And I think we should come back and do a different interview about that. But it continues to go on, and I've organized a session at the next San Francisco Informs meeting called Applications of Little's Law. And there are 2 or 3 impressive papers. One of the issues with Little's Law is it applies in so many situations. I mean, cues are everywhere.
Right.
And things you can think of as cues are everywhere, such as production systems, and things like that.
Well, and you mentioned once to me the applications of, in computer chip design.
Oh yes. Oh yes. Well, I have if you wish, a sequel to my 1961 paper. 2011, excuse me, 2011 is the 50th anniversary. And so I was asked to whether I would like to write a paper, a retrospective paper, and I said yes. And that's published in Operations Research. And there are many fields. Health management. There are many cues inside the computer itself, and so the computer designers are very interested in these issues.
You want to talk about Betty and your family?
Yes. Just a quick. My late wife, Elizabeth A. Little, was a physicist, and as I've mentioned before, and then we've had 4 children, and each of them has been either an engineer or a scientist. But I wanted to say something about her attitudes, because she got a PhD. She finished slightly before me, but we both graduated essentially in 1955 at the graduation then. And what I wanted to say was, people often come up to me and say, well, it must have been very difficult being a woman in the early 50s in a PhD program. I disagree. Her parents, or her father at least, who was a very successful Long Island doctor, who grew up in Vermont, and as was frequently true in that family, his wife asked Betty, "Are you sure it's physics you want?" And Betty said yes. going on in physics? Well, I mean, we were there together in the physics PhD program. She was working very, very hard because some of the courses that I had flunked, she had to pass.
Oh, I see.
But no, there was a physics qualifying exam and then a general exam. And I mean, I never heard her complain about any of these things. She knew what she wanted to do and was doing it.
Mm-hmm.
She had plenty of boyfriends.
Oh.
I fought them off. So that's what I wanted to say, because I don't think that she felt any hardship. And let me tell you the sequel, because she is really interested in research. In Nantucket, because there's no laboratory, or, you know, I was in the Army and things like that, she drifted away from physics. But she became interested in northeastern Indian archaeology, of which Nantucket is loaded with this stuff. And she published her own series of papers. And she went and got a master's degree at UMass Amherst under what I call the reigning queen of, at the time, of the Indian archaeology. And she knew something about, there's a lot of stuff done by radiocarbon dating. And she was totally comfortable with that, and reading the papers and writing the papers. And so she has a whole series. She has a co-authored paper for me. We tried co-authoring when we were in graduate school. It didn't work. Different mentalities. Anyway, but we finally did a co-authored paper for the Journal of Archaeological Science. And she came to me one day and she said, isn't there some way I can process this data? I've made radiocarbon dates in all of these specimens, and I've done that for the plants. And she used to go out and collect plants that are native to the region, and shellfish and things like that. And she says, I have these readings, and I want to say something about the diet. I don't have too many readings. And I said, well, I mean, the diet could be deer, the diet could be quahogs, I mean, whatever. And I said, well, you could put bounds on these things by linear programming. And she says, well, tell me more. And so I wrote a linear program in Express.
Okay.
And I processed her data, and she made me be lead author.
Oh.
Because she said if there are any questions about linear programming, she wants somebody who can answer them. But she was a really good researcher, whatever she touched.
And then your kids I mean,
Oh, kids. Well,
Jack is the
yeah,
founder
Jack.
of MathWorks.
Yeah,
and
Jack is the CEO of MathWorks.
impressive
Right.
accomplishment.
Well, he's a undergraduate EE at MIT and has a master's degree from Stanford, and then got into systems control issues.
Mm-hmm.
But then he saw an opportunity in the PC as a tool for engineering calculations and systems control, signal processing. So he went out and got a top-notch numerical analyst, Cleve Moeller, and conceived. He was also a good writer. My father complimented on his writing of his manuals, but they went to a system of toolboxes where they let anybody use MATLAB to create a signal processing toolbox, and so they could easily expand and get more talent for royalties, basically. And it's been very successful.
Anything about your other kids?
Sarah, all my children have 2 children, so I have 8 grandchildren. Sarah did an undergraduate physics degree at Stanford and then joined the Woods Hole MIT program. And she went down in Alvin. And I tease her. She now lives in Wellesley. I tease her, when you were in Perth on a postdoc, I could go see the world.
Right.
But you're in Wellesley.
Right.
I've seen Wellesley.
Yeah.
But anyway, she's fine, and she's works on environmental issues. Tom is the non-MIT in the crowd. He went to RPI. He's tremendous energy. He formed a company. He was active in the management of the company and sold the company, and is back at BU, where he is in the computer engineering department. He writes papers. He has one which has quotes his own paper next to my Little's Law paper. And then Rule, the youngest, is a solar engineer. He has a undergraduate degree from Johns Hopkins and a master's degree from MIT in the, I don't know, it's the solar engineering crowd is where he has it, and he was in a startup, and they had a lot of good business. They probably still do. Off the grid in California, where they grow marijuana.
Yeah. Right.
Anyway, so that's my crowd.
Yeah. So, I think, to sort of wrap things up, and I don't know how to, sort of do the, how would you like to be remembered? Or no.
You want me to start over?
Yeah, right.
No, but I'll tell you. I'll tell you. I have to be remembered for Little Slaw.
Yeah, right.
Which I should do a better job of explaining. And the other thing is that I think being in on the early years of marketing science is a satisfaction.
Yeah. There's an article in the Sloan magazine, or sort of in the early '80s, that highlighted MD, management decision systems.
Oh yes,
and
yes.
had the picture of all the MIT
That's right.
grads on the stairway and so on. I think MDS is certainly something that I know I want to be remembered for, and I think
No.
I've considered you to be a real role model, and sometimes I wonder, if I had ever gotten a PhD, would that have set me off in just some completely different path? But I'm so glad that we had the opportunity to work together at MDS, and that I was really focused on kind of the working with companies, and that we were always working with companies to come up with ideas that.
Well, you're still doing it.
Yeah, right, right. So,
And that's good.
yeah.
But, well, I'm not finished yet.
No, me either. Okay. So, I guess that wraps up at least this segment of
Yeah.
John Little's history and
Yeah.
operations research.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay,
Right.
thanks.